Howdy. I was just on my way to celebrate payday at the mines, and I passed some fellers on that old freight wagon down there a spell, and they said there was a group of people here in town wanting to know more about the history of those Bohemia mines. You know the ones I'm talking about. And I figured you might be those folks, so if you don't mind, I'll just sit down in this old bar stool and in here in the Helena Saloon on Main Street, and I'll tell you all I know. Well, I guess the first big official notice of the mines came when this 7 book report was made back in 1900 by those fellers out in Washington, D.C. Now, they started that geology office in the 1870s because the whole country was wanting to know about those gold mines out here in the West. They was looking for some place to spend their investment money, and the government needed to know what mines were where. It seems that after 1848, when a feller named Jim Marshall from Oregon was setting up a sawmill on Captain John Sutter's property in Coloma, California, and found gold in the water ditch he was digging, everyone in the country took off for California. Well, J.S. Diller was given the job of writing that book on Bohemia, and he did a mighty thorough job, too, I'll tell you. He walked all over those mountains, talked to the miners, and did some assay work on the different mines to see just how much gold was there. Now, that book was pretty popular, and it's my guess that one of those fellers who read it real careful was old Jonathan Bourne. Now, he was a lawyer from Massachusetts who made a good bit of money in gold mining over around Baker in eastern Oregon. Then he went to Portland and he became a fancy U.S. senator. Well, in 1902, I think it was, he sent a feller out to Bohemia to check out these mines in person. And this here map is part of that feller's report. You can see that wagon road at the bottom just winding its way up to the noonday mill. He even put in the telephone line that was coming up from Cottage Grove. That railroad they was surveying for never did quite get there. That place where the flag is, well, that's where that Forest Service lookout is today, and you folks can just drive right up there real easy. It takes you about 2 hours is all. This young feller also made a fancy map of all the claims in that part of the land. Yes, sir, that mining district sure was a busy place back around 1900, I figure. More than 2,000 claims had been filed by the time this here map was made. Now, this here mountain is Bohemia Mountain. You can look right past Bohemia and see Mount Shasta down there in California. Now, Mr. Diller says that these mountains right around Bohemia, called the Calapooya Range, are pretty interesting. They were built up from sheets of lava that came off those volcanoes further east. A little ground got pushed up later on, too, but most of these mountains were made from lava. There was a little bit of those icy glaciers on top of the mountains near Champion Creek, but the volcanoes did most of the work. If you look real hard at that grassy place in this picture, you can see the meadows around where the miners graze their horses. Those piles of sandy-looking stuff are the tailings from the Music Mine in Bohemia City, but I'll tell you about them later on. Diller says there was lots of happening at these mountains. Seems like they were the wall between the coast and the Cascade Mountains at the edge of that real old ocean that used to be all the way down to the Willamette Valley. He also said that the gold didn't get into these here mountains when they were formed from the lava. No, sir, this hot melted stuff from down in the earth sort of bubbled up inside the cool lava and filled in the spaces with the minerals that later got hard and stayed in the mountains as the ore with the gold, silver, lead, copper, and zinc that us miners found here later on. Now, this picture is of Grouse Mountain, where the Knott and Annie mines, the Noonday, the Helena, and Champion mines were. The old Knott Trail went over these hills. If you look over the opposite side of Fairview, you can see Grizzly Mountain. The old Noonday Trail would follow the ridge all the way over the mountain to the Noonday Mine. There's a place on that ridge called Dead Horse Hill, 'cause the climb was so hard on those poor critters. Guess old Horse Heaven Creek was named because they could finally rest when they got up to its headwaters. Well, that's enough talk about the mines for a bit. Now let's take a look at the town where those miners got their supplies and spent their money. Now this here is a picture of Cottage Grove from Mount David back in 1892. Wasn't much to it then, I suppose, but there was even less when gold was discovered in 1858 by fellers called Oglesby and Shields and Adams. Why, there wasn't even real town in the 1850s. People used the old Indian trails to get around. You see, there was two things that settled this country, and logging wasn't one of 'em. The first was the California gold rush back in 1849. Folks came west to mine, not to settle, but some smart people figured the miners would need supplies. So folks even as far north as the Willamette Valley were raising their own food and sending the extra on pack trains down into California. Well, miners started coming back from California when it just got too darn blamed crowded. They started remembering some rich-looking hills and old creek beds back home. So they came back to Oregon and brought their California gold and settled in to find their mines around these here parts. The other thing that settled this place was the land. The government's Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 let white residents get 320 acres for free if he or she lived on the land for 4 years. Some of our donation land claim people were Chapin and Shields and McFarland. Then there was Grisman and Mosby, Sears and Vaughn. Most of them worked in the mines a time or two themselves. The government also passed the Homestead Act in 1862 under President Lincoln that let people claim up to 160 acres of public land if they lived on it and approved it for 3 years. By 1885, the people were rushing to this here valley. Now this picture of the back of that brick store that is your Main Street shoe shop shows just how fancy the houses were getting. There was even a real estate office that dealt in mining properties. You see, in 1863, George Ramsey and Jim Johnson were leaving trouble behind in Roseburg and decided to hide out in the Calapooyas until things kind of quieted down. They followed the North Umpqua River up to City Creek near Bohemia Mountain. There they saw a shiny gold quartz. They came to these settlers to share the good news, and the rush was on. In 1864 and 1865, O.P. Adams, Squire Vaughn, and I think it was Bird Ferrier, find time to go prospecting. Now this here's a page in the Bohemia Nugget paper back in 1904. It shows just how many people were helped by business from the mines. The newspaper was owned at that time by a corporation of F.J. Hard, I believe it was. A Bohemia mining man from Colorado was a member. The Nugget only lasted 8 years against the other two papers in this busy town. Even though the railroad came through this town in 1872, the main way to the mines was by horses and freight wagons. There was more than one livery stable in town and a couple of freight lines that went to the mines and brought back the ore and concentrates from the mines. This stable belonged to Jim Potts and Alf Powell around 1906. It was on this spot where your Ben Franklin Bank is built. Now here's George McQueen, Jim Plaster, and Jim Potts, all waiting on the stage for their 3-day trip back to the mines. Some of the old freighters in the day were Robert Mosby, Joe Cole, Charlie, Carl, and Ben Pitcher, Rube Nelson, and don't forget Joe Damewood, who later on was a marshal here in Cottage Grove. Wes Crispin ran freighters and a stage line to the mines. He lived near the Row River and used his barns for freight stops. He ran the Fashion Stable in Cottage Grove and sent stage coaches to Bohemia, also onto the Black Butte Mercury mines out London way. Freight rates cost between 1 and 2 cents a pound back in those days. Ed Patterson was one of his Bohemia drivers. Folks in these parts said that he was the best of the hee-haws who handled the ribbons. He'd leave town with the baggage and the mail and the passengers about 7 a.m., and he'd be at Red Bridge by 12 noon and the Ridge Hotel for the night. Those freight lines took everything up to the mines, even fancy wood-burning stoves and all the utensils. The mining people bought some things here at the Piper and Holderman store, the first hardware store in town. It was built back in 1891 at the corner of South River Road and Willamette Court. River Road, you know, used to be the main street of this town before the railroad came through on the east side of the river. Why, your new Main Street was just an old swampy wagon road with a covered bridge to the Row River people. It was so muddy, and some places were built on stilts 'cause of the winter floods. People used boats on these streets in the flood season. In 1902, buildings were going up on the street between the river and the train tracks. So Mr. Charles Vandenberg, there on the left, and Sid Piper on the right, opened a fancier store to serve the town. The mines were booming and the population had gone from 800 to 3,000, all that in just a few years. You can see on this here store bill that the same store handled the blasting powder and miner supplies that went up to the Knowles and Getty's store at the music mine on Bohemia Mountain. Prices weren't too bad then. 3 claw hammers sold for $1.65. Miners needed some special stuff, you know. There was a big place in Portland, the Marshall Wells Hardware Company, I think it was called, that put out a big catalog of all kinds of supplies, and they could be sent by train. Can you imagine that? $13.50 for 12 shovels. Every miner needed to do some assay work to see if there was enough gold in the ore to pay the bills. And this store supplied a fancy set of mining scales for $3. Those mines were sure dark places, and there was a whole selection of miners' lamps. They were made of tin with a copper spout. A copper wire went down into the bowl to heat the oil. Now, these lamps were just stuck into the walls of the tunnel. Men also might use the same kind of a clamp with a candle holder on it. About 1905, George Knowles left the store and the post office that he was running in Bohemia City at the music mine, and he came to town and went into partnership with Gottfried, or maybe it was Fred Grabber, a man who came here from Switzerland to work in the mines. Knowles and Grabber opened a store in this here building to handle mining and logging supplies. You know the store is Pioneer Hardware Store today. There was other people supplying the mines, too. One was the Bartels family. Now, they came here from Kansas back in 1900 and got into the refrigeration, meat cutting, and mining businesses. Bartels opened a refrigeration plant in town and then a meat market that supplied the mines and the CCC camps. They'd make a little money in the market, then lease it and go mining. Bill is that young feller there in the picture. Oh, there's Bill again with his dad in the constable, Green Pitcher. Now, Pitcher served on the police force for some 32 years. Never used a gun to make an arrest. The kids loved that guy. See, that meat store kept the meat out in the open. Didn't even have windows, trying to keep the place colder. They sold and carried the meat to the mines. Why, once a week, Bill even skied in with the meat in the winter. Another time, they even flew in the meat with an airplane from Eugene when mine supplies got low. Boy, did that story make the papers. Even got on the news in Hollywood. Now, here's a picture of Main Street back in 1911. That fancy brick building there had to be taken out when the Pacific Highway came through town. No paving yet either, still a horse and buggy wagon. Long about 1900, a mining friend and builder, George Lee, had the contract for putting gravel in wooden gutters here in town. He hauled rock from the Spray Rock Company, where Zumwalt and Williams is today. Old Doc Oglesby, a fancy-dressed miner and doctor, decided to assay that gravel, and he found gold in it, sure enough. Wasn't enough to pay, however, at $20 an ounce, so they just let it go. Isn't that something? Streets paved with gold right here in Cottage Grove. They told that story in Ripley's Believe It or Not. That train there was the center of activity. Everyone came to the depot to see what was happening. When people on the east side of the river finally stopped calling the place Lematai in 1901, the depot could hang up one sign instead of 3, including Slabtown, the old name for the west part of Cottage Grove. The name came from the wood slabs that were thrown in the muddy streets in the wintertime. The Bohemia mines were responsible for getting the first short-line railroad in this town. They had to get that ore to the smelter in Tacoma, Washington. Saginaw was competing to get the depot, but the Cottage Grove government and the mill owner gave free land, and the Oregon Securities Mining Company put up the money. And the Oregon and Southeastern Railroad was here by 1904. That old 440 Cook engine ran the line till it was wrecked back in 1941. This here's the number 9 engine at the depot in 1921. Every Sunday, folks would take the pleasure ride to Wildwood Falls and Red Bridge. On weekdays, the work trip to Diston took about 2 hours more or less. Now, this here train photo was taken near Diston back in 1908, when the train had to give up most of its passengers to that newfangled invention, the automobile. The Galloping Goose came into service for the local folks. It was made from an abandoned four-cylinder Buick engine and the body of an old streetcar. In 1919, 17,000 people rode that rickety old thing over the uneven rails up to the hills. Here's another crazy idea. They call it the speeder, a little handcar that could make a quick trip up to the mountains. Once you got up to Culp Creek on your way to the mines, you had to decide which way to go. You turned right at Red Bridge, which was a covered bridge painted with barn paint, and you headed up Sharps Creek over Staples Bridge to make your way to the Vesuvius Mine or Fairview Mountain. At Red Bridge, there was a boarding house, a two-story saloon, and the Bucket of Blood dance hall. You could keep following the Raw River to Diston and make your way up the Bryce's Creek or Brass Creek Trail. Those roads are at the top of the picture. The lower roads to the right go to Oakland and the North Umpqua. This here map shows you the mines and the rest places. On the lower Sharps Creek, there's the Mineral Hotel. On the old Noonday Trail at the top of the picture is the Ridge Hotel. All those X's are where the ruins of miners' cabins have been found. Well, those freight people had all sorts of inventions to get the goods up that mountain. That old egg crate made from bed springs is in your museum today. There are other items from the mines there, too. Now, all of those things had to fit in the back of pack saddles that held the weight real tight so the horses wouldn't complain too much. Miles Pitcher used this saddle to haul mail from his log cabin home and post office in Darena, or Star, as it used to be called. Now, if you were taking the trip up Bryce's Creek, you could stop for the night at Lund Park, which was a stage stop started by Harry Parker and